start, I feel sure that the response to your very exciting comments and actually logical forecast of what's going to happen in the next 20 years speak for themselves, including the warning and your apprehension of what might call all bets off. I think that you would all agree that the program this afternoon couldn't have been better in any respect. I know I certainly feel it.
This is Bob Tucker at the Oklahoma State Chamber of Commerce meeting at Fountainhead Lodge, Friday, November the 12th, 1971. The next speaker that you will hear will be Dr. William O. Rieke, Vice-Chancellor for Health Affairs, University of Kansas Medical Center. The title of his talk will be Medicine, Next 25 Years.
And to give you some background on Dr. Rieke, he's a native of the state of Washington, being born in Odessa, Washington. He took his bachelor's degree from Pacific Lutheran College in Parkland, Washington, and his medical doctor's degree with honors from the University of Washington School of Medicine, Seattle. He has held positions at the University of Iowa School of College of Medicine and the University of Washington in Seattle. He is the author of numerous medical publications and books, some of which were authored individually and some as co-authors. He has been a member of the editorial board of the American Journal of Anatomy. He is a member of the Interdisciplinary Basic Science Test Committee of the National Board of Medical Examiners. He is chairman of the College of Medicine Executive Committee, chairman of the Search Committee for the Dean of College of Medicine, these being at the university. He is a member of the University Editorial Review Board. Dr. Rieke is currently serving as Vice-Chancellor of Health Affairs for the University of Kansas Medical Center, Kansas City, Kansas. So it gives me pleasure at this time to present to you Dr. William O. Rieke.
Mr. Thompson, ladies and gentlemen, I never took to an introduction, but I'm reminded of what happened to Monty Duvall, who is presently Assistant Secretary for Health and formerly Dean of the University of Arizona School of Medicine. A couple of months ago, Dr. Duvall was introduced to the American Hospital Association with what he took to be an exceedingly long and elaborate statement of his accomplishments. The person who was introducing him said that, in fact, among his many other talents, he had a who's who that was 9 inches in length. This produced a little tittering in the audience, and Monty, being equal to the occasion, arose to say that he was gratified but unaware that he had been bestowed with such an endowment, but he felt challenged to accept the responsibility and to rise to the occasion. And in a way, that's the way I feel this morning, challenged to accept the responsibility of speaking a bit about medicine as we might perceive it for the next 25 years. And Mrs. Rieke and I are very grateful to you, members of the Oklahoma State Chamber of Commerce, for inviting us to come. We have appreciated seeing your state, and we enjoyed particularly the wonderful hospitality afforded to us by Mr. Dowse, who was good enough to pick us up after I was speaking to the Kansas State Hospital Association yesterday by plane. Flew us down in time of still daylight, and we saw a great deal of some of the beauties that occur here in the fall time. And we are really found it a very enjoyable thing all the way through. I have really no little trepidation in approaching the topic this morning because which of us can predict the future? And my crystal ball is no brighter than anybody else's, I don't believe. There are, in fact, of course, many influences that will be unpredictable, that will determine what's going to happen to medicine in the next 25 years. We know, of course, that the rate of change is accelerating, but we are uncertain as to what the constant will be that can be applied to that rate. Among those factors that determine the change in rate are things like how much money is going to be available for studies in medicine and for education methods. What will social attitudes be toward medical research and medical education, the balance between these two in the future. We know, just to take one example, that we are experiencing at the moment a wave of sort of anti-intellectualism, which is in a way a sort of a backlash against the last 20 years of what is perceived as being overemphasis on science in medicine. Should this proceed and should it go on and develop, the anti-intellectual attitude could spill over to have very adverse effects on the rate of progress in medicine. These things, I think, are not predictable, so I have a little bit of trepidation in thinking about what might happen in the next 25 years. I also have a little concern for, in spite of whatever disclaimers for responsibility that I might offer to you this morning, that is to say, don't hold me liable for what I say. In spite of whatever I offer, I cannot absolve myself totally from guilt. And you will remember, at least in part, what I have said, and some of you may remind me about this some years hence when it proves to be wrong. And I think history here holds a tremendous lesson for us. For you will recall with me that it was about 2,000 years ago when a certain Roman governor by the name of Pontius Pilate had cynically asked, "What is truth?" And failing to find an answer to that, he went to a public ritual of washing his hands, which was designed to absolve himself from all guilt in a proclamation that he then issued. And he never really has been quite forgiven for that, nor has he been forgotten. So I cannot then absolve myself by saying I disclaim responsibility, even though I wish I might. My anxiety level is also increased by full knowledge of the great breadth and the great extent of the field that I am to discuss. There really is too much. And the best I can do is present a few selected areas, a few examples. It's a little bit, in my mind, a lengthy account of the psychiatrist and the proctologist who went into practice together. Psychiatry, of course, you know, deals with problems that are above what we would call the sensorium anatomy, above here. Proctology, on the other hand, deals with problems that are somewhat more distally situated, specifically at the farthest end of the gastrointestinal canal. The psychiatrist and the proctologist established practice, sort of an odd combination, you might say, but decided that they would try to play it straight and put out a sign saying psychiatry and proctology. They didn't do very well. They didn't draw many customers. So then they decided, well, we need something with a little more charisma here, and so they changed their sign and made an abrupt transition from psychiatry and proctology to nuts and butts. This drew quite a crowd, but not anywhere near as many as they got when they changed again to odds and ends. And it is that latter theme of odds and ends that really permeates my discussion this morning. And if you'll accept that as an apology in advance, what I have in mind is a brief discussion, and largely it will be an anecdotal analysis, of three areas which clearly will undergo marked change in the next 25 years, although I cannot specify their exact timing or their rate of change. These three areas are, first, changes in the organization and delivery of health care in the United States. Secondly, changes in the conquest of certain diseases and in our ability to control and alter the most fundamental of life's processes. And third, the changes in our social structure, in our system of values, and our processes by which we make decisions that will inevitably be produced by the alterations in the first two areas, and which we will certainly have to face. Well, may we begin then. Changes in the organization and delivery of health care in the United States. While in many respects our country has the greatest of all healthcare systems, there are, as we all know, many problems. At least as perceived by the public, the demand for health service far exceeds our ability to supply it. There are too few health professionals. From recent studies, none of which, incidentally, were really based on hard data, the magic figure of 50,000 more physicians has emerged and has been accepted by the Congress of the United States as being canonical. 50,000 more physicians we need, we are told. There are too few MDs. We also realize that there are too few of other health professionals of all kinds. And finally, we realize that there are problems in the distribution and the availability of health services. We know, for example, that you have a better chance of surviving if you are wounded in Vietnam than you have if you are injured in an automobile accident on Interstate 40, 70, or 80. We know, for example, that the types of specialization that have engaged our physicians in the past have led to a downgrading of the type of specialization that we now would call family physicians, those people who serve as the primary focus of entry into the healthcare system. And this has given us difficulty in terms of availability of healthcare services. And so these problems are producing marked alterations in our systems for producing health professionals and for delivering health care. And I want to talk about both of those. First, our system for producing health professionals. Consider, if you will, for a moment our educational systems and what's happening to them. There are many new programs that are burgeoning around the country today. Many new programs for training physicians. Most medical schools in the United States either have established already new departments of family practice or very soon will. In addition, many other health professional training programs are springing up all over. There are presently over 581 separate health specialties recognized as being involved in patient care. Everything from pharmacy through allied health, through physicians and nurses and the whole bit. 581. The interdigitation among these various professional groups is just a tad difficult to understand. New educational methods are coming along. Self-instructional models involving computers and all of the audiovisual aids that are so current and present, so useful in many educational areas, are finally being employed by medical schools. I say finally because departments of psychology and undergraduate situations were using these many years ago. You may know that next year NASA will launch a satellite which will be designed to service the entire Midwest area from the Appalachians to the Rockies, and will be designed entirely for communications and biomedicine, such that a lecture in Kansas City might be presented to a College of Medicine class in Oklahoma City via satellite. Or a demonstration in Colorado might be made available to the entire state of Oklahoma, if you wish, in continuing education via satellite. So new methods for education are coming in, and likewise new curricular changes are being involved. Most of these curricular changes, however, deal with time rather than content, and to me this is a great tragedy. For we take the easy problem, which is what do you do with time and how do you arrange things mechanically, and we address ourselves to that rather than addressing ourselves to what we really should be putting in the curriculum. And the reason, of course, that we deal with time rather than content is that it is so much simpler. Who knows what is a good physician? You might help me define a bad physician very readily, and I think perhaps you might even have examples in mind. But can you define a good physician for me? If you could, I could define the curriculum much better, you see. Well, in spite of that, many other changes are coming in educational institutions. There are, for example, 5 new medical schools that opened in the United States this summer. The total medical schools in the U.S. are now 108. Among these 108 medical schools, there are 43,000 medical students currently receiving their education. This is an all-time high. The number of freshmen in medical school as of September of this year, 1971, was 11,858. Again, an all-time high. Compared to a year ago, though, the number was only 500 greater. There were 11,360 in the fall of 1970. And while it is an increase of 500, it is only minuscule in regard to and with respect to the demand. So changes are coming, but they are yet in this rate in educational areas too slow and too little. In addition, new programs of government financing for medical education are developing very rapidly and will have tremendous importance to us. On Tuesday of this week, for example, we saw the House pass the conference report of H.R. 8629, which is the Comprehensive Health Manpower Training Act for 1971. The Senate had previously passed the bill, and the bill is now on the President's desk, either for signature or perhaps he has already signed. I haven't seen this morning's paper. This is a milestone in federal policy towards financing health education. Although the government has long been involved in financing medical schools in one way or another, this financing has been episodic and has been directed toward projects or toward events, rather than toward a continuing baseline of financing. The new legislation turns financing away so much from episodic or project financing toward capitation, saying we will pay you so many dollars for each student that is present in a school at a given period of time. It has a tremendous advantage to all medical schools, for it provides a continuing base of support upon which realistic planning can be done, rather than having to be forced to jump from one project to the next as federal dollars shift from one project to the next. There are, however, at least 2 important cautions to be advanced and to be observed when we think of new federal legislation in regard to financing healthcare education. One of these, of course, is purely a practical matter that you would expect me as administrator to be concerned about, and that is that while the papers say House passes H.R. 8629, billions of dollars voted to train physicians, all of us who've been in the game long enough know that there's a big difference between authorizing legislation and appropriating legislation. They come from separate committees. They're separate steps. Likewise, all of us know that there's a similar big difference between appropriating legislation and what will be released by the Office of Management and Budget. Most of us have experienced that as you go from authorization to appropriation to release by OMB, you have a truncated effect that is like passing from a great gorge into a narrow funnel and emerging from a tiny spigot. And so there is a real difference between what we say we will do and what we will do, and schools have to be aware of it. There is another implication, however, that is even broader in its scope, and that is, while the new federal plans are very important to us, and I would not want to minimize them, I think they are great, and I'm all for them, and I'm grateful for them, there is, of course, every time one buys federal support, the implication that one is buying federal control. Thus far, the controls that have come to us have been minimal. In the new legislation, I think also they are mild. However, they have the portent of becoming even greater. Let me give you just a couple examples. In the new legislation involving capitation support, there are determining clauses that will tell us the direction, the content, and the methods that we will use in health education. For example, the direction will be determined by telling us now, if you choose to train so many primary physicians as opposed to specialists in surgery, we will award you more money for this type of endeavor than we will for training a surgeon. And so by selection process, the pressure being added dollars, direction can be easily determined. Content similarly can be determined by telling medical schools, as the new bills do, that we will reward you if you shorten the content of your training from 4 years to 3 years. It's really this length, but it also involves content. And finally, methods can be determined and will be in the new bills, because again, there are rewards placed for those who will be innovative in terms of curriculum, innovative in terms of developing self-instructional models, and all of this may be very good, but all of this ties us very, very close to a body that can be very remote. And so some in our society would make the announcement that the ancient Romans used to make when they looked at products, and they said, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Others would say, no, thank you, we're grateful for the support, we'll work with the regulations, and we will work as we see it appropriate in the directions as we see that we can. My reaction is that most of us are very desperately, entirely grateful for the help that was so desperately needed. But there are the implications that must be observed. So much for educational systems. Let's consider for a moment our health delivery system. The image of university medical centers across the nation has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. It used to be that a medical center was pretty much self-contained and inward-looking, concerned with its own products, and concerned with producing high-quality physicians and other healthcare personnel, but not too much involved with service or the interface between education and service or the delivery of that service. This has changed markedly, again, in part due to federal legislation. Some universities, particularly on the East Coast, have become totally committed to service, and we know of 1 or 2 strong universities that have become so involved in delivering community service that they have overwhelmed their faculty's capacity to train and have suffered because of this. And so there are dangers here, too. I think, however, that the image of most medical centers is changing away from one of being entirely inward-looking to one being where will we find the balance between only concerning ourselves about education on one hand, or on the other hand, becoming so involved with service that we can no longer educate. And most university medical centers are trying to lead in the example of doing experimental designs and patterns with delivery of health care, such that they can become an interfacing system between education and service, and yet not be overwhelmed by the latter. Likewise, the structures through which health care is delivered will be altered even more radically and more rapidly than we have seen in the past. All of you are aware of Title 18 and Title 19 amendments to the Social Security legislation, dealing respectively with Medicare and Medicaid. I think all of you are aware that there were great impacts on these legislation, impacts that were not foreseen, such that the actuarial data were missed somewhere between a factor of 2 and 5 times, overextended over what we thought it would be in the mid-60s when this legislation went in. Most of you may be also aware that there is a new kind of legislation that's coming very soon that will have even more impact than did either Title 18 or 19. And this is legislation relating to health maintenance organizations. HMO. What is an HMO? Well, an HMO is a concept. It is a concept which involves a contractual agreement between the providers of health care and some agency or mechanism for underwriting the cost of delivering the service. So it's a contract between those who deliver the service and some agency or insuring mechanism, for example, that will underwrite the cost of delivering that service. Now, there are many unanswered questions about HMOs. How, for example, will the providers of health care be organized? Will there be groups of physicians and groups of teams of health care personnel? Will they be organized like Kaiser Permanente has been? Or will there be a closed group? Or will there be a large foundation? For example, a county medical society, will it organize itself as a foundation to become a provider and to negotiate with the underwriters? All of these questions are as yet unanswered. Or we may ask also, how will the cost be underwritten? Certainly the federal government must be involved somehow. But if it pays the total cost and operates as a huge monolithic organization, we are apt to experience with this HMO the same thing we experienced with Title 18 and Title 19, which is really both fiscal and professional disaster. Healthcare is viewed as being a right, and in fact it ought to be a right, but it isn't today because we are not tooled up to deliver it. And you can legislate whatever you wish, we are not yet able to deliver all the health care, and we must be very careful as we look to systems for providing health care if we are lest we run the risk of swamping our ability to provide service. Well, a lot of unanswered questions. But one thing we do know, and that is it is clear that there will be some sort of legislation soon on HMOs, and by soon I'm talking about this winter or this early spring at the latest. It is clear that sooner or later we're going to have some sort of national health insurance. The general economic conditions and the freeze that we have experienced in the last few months have prolonged the time when national health insurance is going to emerge. Probably it won't be for a year or two now, but it is going to come. And it is also clear that there will be direct influence on government and health care delivery, just as there is now direct influence between government and health care education. Well, in the meantime, while awaiting this federal legislation, professional and non-government health groups have been working very hard to reorganize and propose other reorganizations of our health care delivery systems. And I want to just share one example of the kind of effort that is going on outside of government circles. On the 1st of this month, Dr. William G. Anlian, who is the Vice President for Health Affairs at Duke University and is the immediate past chairman of the Association of American Medical Colleges, presented the chairman's address to the meeting of the Association of American Medical Colleges in Washington, D.C. And in this address, he proposed a system which he called a time availability system for the delivery of health care. And this time availability system that he proposed would take the following form. Admitting that we have difficulties in securing adequate service, he said, let's take care of our dire emergencies within 0 to 15 minutes after they occur by preparing a nationalized group of self and buddy care teams involving nationally prepared videotape instruction programs. Videotape instruction programs given to sophomores, to juniors, to seniors in high school. And through these videotape self-instruction programs at the high school level, develop teams of self and buddy care individuals who can respond to dire emergencies within 0 to 15 minutes wherever they may occur. Then he said, let's go on beyond this and provide care within 15 to 30 minutes of availability, which will involve squads, like rescue squads, only using allied health personnel. And he pointed out that these allied health personnel could very well be trained at our existing academic health centers, and that among these allied health personnel, we certainly could make better use of nurses. It has long been known, although Dr. Anlian didn't mention this, it has long been known that nurses, particularly RNs, constitute one of the greatest untapped resources that we have of trained personnel in the United States today. There are about 1.3 million RNs in the U.S. Of these, only about half are actively in practice, and the other half are not practicing. So here's a group of healthcare professionals who, if their training could be restructured to academic health centers, might be designed to lead, they and others, designed to lead in this business of providing rescue squads on a 15 to 30 minute availability basis. And then Dr. Anlian continued, after this, let's have primary medical care available within 1 hour of need, and these primary medical care individuals should be physicians who are generalists by and large. And then within 2 hours, let's have secondary medical care available, secondary medical care such as we now know it from specialists. And then within 5 hours of need, let's have tertiary medical care available. Tertiary medical care in this case meaning medical care as delivered to a university medical center with all the advanced and complicated and sophisticated services available there. And so there is an effort on the part of the leaders in academic health centers to organize ourselves again on our own to meet the demand for the delivery of health care. Well, so much for health care delivery systems. Let's make a transition now, if we can, after having talked a bit about the first part, and talk now a bit about changes that I see coming in the context of certain diseases
and in our ability to control and alter the most fundamental of life processes. And here again I really feel some trepidation and concern. It could be so easy to engage in dramatic polemics or in shocking stories. It would be so simple to tell you all of the great and wonderful things that indeed might be, and that indeed would perhaps distress and disturb you enough that you'd remember and prove me wrong a few years from now. And responsibility, on the other hand, requires that I temper it just a tad. In addition, scientific facts and prediction are not yet all that solid in these particular fields. In a way, I feel myself a little bit like the story of the two churches, one Catholic and one Protestant, who used to have services at the same time every Sunday. And there was a Catholic church here and a Protestant church there, and there was a vacant lot between them. And they always had services at the same time, such that they could finish and then go out and play baseball together in the vacant lot. And this worked out very well. Except one Sunday, the Protestant minister got a little carried away, and his sermon went longer than it usually did. And the Catholics discerned that anybody was ever going to join and started to play by themselves out on the field. And as the game went on, the Protestant minister was continuing to preach, and the window was open because it was a hot summer day, and they were playing, and he was preaching, and they were playing, and he was preaching. And as he neared the point of climax of his sermon, he cried to his audience, "How then shall we reach the kingdom of heaven? How then shall we enter the kingdom of God?" And at that point, from the playing field, they came to the open window to call, "Fly, you son of a bitch, fly." And in a way, that's what I'm going to have to do, too, as I talk to you about the conquest of disease. I'm going to try just a little. I'm going to have to, because I'm not all that certain, nor can anyone else be. It is clear, however, that the conquest of disease has progressed rapidly and mightily, and in fact is in large part responsible for one of the great dilemmas that we face today, and that is, of course, the dilemma of the population explosion. The doubling time for all of the Earth's populace is today probably on the order of 35 years, and that doubling time is shrinking. And you all know, of course, about this. And while the little paperback entitled The Population Bomb, edited by Paul Ehrlich, and which was so popular a year ago, has now been replaced by another little paperback called Future Shock, edited by Alvin Toffler. Although the book has been replaced, the bomb has not. And the bomb is still there, and the fuse is still burning. And we know that we must face up to the issue of population control, particularly in the underdeveloped, the economically underdeveloped nations. For if we do not, we are going to again face destruction and putting ourselves out of business altogether. Some progress has been made in birth control measures. We know that there are now many methods, and I'll say a word or two more about this in just a moment, that are very effective if used. But of course the problem of their use is a real one, and so many places have turned away from birth control toward therapeutic abortion. You know, for example, that Japan brought its population under control largely through wide-scale therapeutic abortion. You know that therapeutic abortion laws exist now in many states in the United States. You know there are many problems with these laws. The laws are being tested. Courts are being brought in again and again, most recently in California, where part of the California Code was struck down in favor of the more liberal provisions, saying that therapeutic abortion is a matter of decision between only the patient and her physician. The issue here is so emotional and so charged that it is tremendously touching, and we must be certain that we have a social consensus and a social agreement. And then that we police our practices very, very carefully, else we put ourselves into such a turmoil that disaster will result. And yet this is an issue that we are going to have to face very, very soon, and are facing in many states already. While there are better means of facing a population explosion, I think, than therapeutic abortion, and this, of course, is better means of birth control. And while the preventatives are effective if used, the ones that are most interesting to most of us now are not the preventatives, but rather the after-the-fact event. The so-called morning-after pill, if you will. There are morning-after pills that are realities already. They are, however, not without risk. One of these is diethylstilbestrol, which is given in high dose will cause a failure of implantation of the fertilized ovum. We'll say a word or two more about that. One of the more promising recent substances, though, comes in the general class of prostaglandins. The prostaglandins are known to cause marked contraction of the uterus and the stepping off of the fertilized ovum just before or even immediately after it has implanted. They too, however, are not without their side effects, and much research needs yet to be done to determine their safety. But a lot is being done here, and I look forward very soon to very effective morning-after measures for the birth control method. Our population certainly must We must stabilize it. Well, what is the control, if we're talking about birth and birth control? Let's ask the question about what is the control of breeding, or selective breeding, or eugenics, if you like that. And here I have to make a specific reference to. Ivan Tucker, in his book Future Shock, tells us that in 10 or 15 years, a woman may go to an embryo bank and buy frozen embryos and implant it in her uterus, and then she will have thereby a trace of what type of offspring she desires. Type relating to sex, IQ, body size and conformity, eye color, hair color, and especially, Mr. Parker notes, absolute genetic guarantee of the quality. You know, I was enjoying this book as long as he was talking about physics and chemistry and things that were outside my realm. When he got to this one, I sort of came up short. Here there is some truth in the possibility of such development. I must take exception to the statements as they are advanced, particularly of the reference of time that he has given. Mr. Parker quotes the work of two biologists, both of them known by reputation and one in person to me, in making these assertions. One of these is Dr. Hafford, who in 1965, when the reference of Mr. Parker's site was produced, Dr. Hafford was at Washington State University of Pullman. He subsequently left there and gone to Detroit. His work has really not advanced much since 1965. I note with some interest that the reference that Mr. Parker quotes of Dr. Hafford comes from that noted scientific journal called Life. Dr. Hafford serves as the primary authority for saying that within 10 to 15 years, the fusion embryo bit will be a reality. The other biologist who serves as an authority in this field and is quoted by Mr. Parker is a woman by the name of Beatrice Smith. Beatrice is known to me. She is a very able and very dedicated experimental embryologist who works at the Institute of Cancer Research in Philadelphia. Her work has been largely with the experimental fusion of fertilized ova of mice. And what she has shown is that you can take a mouse ovum and fertilize it, say some white mouse if you like, and you can take another mouse ovum and fertilize it, say some black mouse, and then you can take these two fertilized ova, and if you treat them appropriately in the test tube, well, they'll fuse. And what you'll get out of that is a true mixture.
If you take that fertilized ovum and put it back into the uterus of another mouse and let it develop a birth, what you get out of that is a true mixture having 4 parents, not 2 white ones, 2 black ones, and you'll get a mouse that is truly a chimera. A chimera means a true genetic mixture. And that's great for mice. There are some other problems, however, when one leaves the mice field. Dr. Mintz's work has not progressed beyond the point of fusion of mouse embryos. It has not been possible to cross-fuse between species, and we'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. This seems to be such a sensational issue that I wanted to take just a moment to tell you what really are the facts. And if you could see that slide, please. I'd like to digress a moment to show you what are the facts. And now we go to the birds and bees part. This is a diagram made by Frank Netter, who, as many of you may know, is a noted medical artist. And if you look first at the upper left-hand section of that slide, you'll see a frontal section through the uterus and the oviduct, and off to the side, one sees the ovaries. I really should have it pointed, but right up there is the ovaries. Right up here is the ovaries, and a normal course of events, and babies and test tubes, and that whole bit is concerned. It has only recently, and by recently I mean like this year, been possible to fertilize human ova in test tubes. While it has been possible to do it with animal ova many years before, it has only been this year that Drs. Edwards and Septo in England reported the fertilization of human ova in test tubes. These fertilized ova could be maintained in test tubes up through the blastocyst stage, that's the tennis ball stage, if you will, up through the blastocyst stage, but not beyond. It could not be cultured beyond that point, nor can animal ova be cultured beyond that point. They have then to be reimplanted in the uterus if they're going to be kept alive. In animals, this reimplantation has been done. In man, it has not been done. And more than that, there is some real doubt that even if they are reimplanted, that they will take in man for reasons that are not yet understood. So, the point then is that fertilization of human ova has just been accomplished in the test tube. Culture of human embryos has been accomplished only through the blastocyst stage, and reimplantation has not been accomplished at all. There has been no success in attempts of freezing a blastocyst from any form, let alone a full-formed embryo, and then having it come back to life again. And this has been tried in animals. Blastocysts have been frozen and then thawed and tried to be reimplanted, and they all die and go nowhere. It has not even been attempted, of course, in the human, for reimplantation has not even been attempted in the human. More so, there has been no crossing of species artificially. It is not possible yet to fertilize a mouse ovum, if you will, with a rat sperm. It is not possible to fertilize a human ovum with a chimpanzee sperm. There has been no crossing of species in artificial fertilization successful such that anything would happen at the very most beyond a few abortive cell divisions, no successful formation of even a good blastocyst. And most important of all, there is absolutely no certainty of genetic control in such artificial experiments. While sex could be determined, if, as Mr. Toffler suggests, we knew something about the cell constituency, and some kind of information could be obtained about body traits and perhaps IQ by knowing who the parents were and what their IQ and body traits were, there is absolutely no control of mutations that could very readily occur as these embryos develop. And so it is terribly misleading to suggest that genetic quality can be guaranteed by the kind of thing that is envisioned in extra-human insemination and development. Here's the life equation. It is true that research in genetic control is one of the most exciting and active fields in all of modern biology today, but it is still a very elementary one. It is one that is at a very early level. While an artificial gene can be produced, that is to say, it's possible to build a little chunk of DNA, the genetic material in a cell, and in a test tube it is possible to take this little chunk of DNA and have it in turn direct the production of a specific protein. It's possible to do that all now. That's all very exciting, and that's all very new within the last 15 years. Still, that is a monumental step. It is many light years away, if you like, from producing a single cell, let alone a single organism. And so our genetic research, while it is exciting and tremendously viable today, is many, many, many miles away, in my judgment, from doing anything like producing whole embryos or babies in test tubes. There may be, soon, some ways of altering and correcting specific genetic inherited defects, but this, too, must not be confused with our ability to produce total individuals by a mechanical means. And again, even if we could do that, there would still be no absolute quality control. So while 25 years is a long time in the field of science, and it would be really presumptuous of me to say, no, it cannot happen, I would not say that, I nonetheless do not foresee the type of breeding or eugenic control that Mr. Toffler suggests. I do not foresee the type of embryo banking in 25 years that we read about. I do not see that professionally, and besides that, from a personal point of view, this is one of those areas where I would rather do it myself. There are two areas, though, where we can be more definite, and where we perhaps can attach a time frame. And one of these is in the control of cancer. And here again, I'm speaking a little bit out on the limb, well, quite a little bit out on the limb, but it's a little better than what I was talking about before. What is cancer to begin with? Well, it's much easier for me to tell you what it's not than what it is. I can tell you what it's not in the sense that it is not a disease. It is not one disease. It is a multifaceted myriad of diseases, caused perhaps by many, many agents that are yet undetermined, although the viral etiology of cancer, as you know, is rapidly gaining believers and is rapidly having information put behind it to make it much more plausible than it was a few years ago. Really all we can say, though, for sure about cancer is that it is an uncontrolled development and proliferation and multiplication of cells. It comes in many forms, in many locations, with a variety of degrees of malignancy. Some are highly malignant, some are not malignant at all. Some seem to stay for a long time, others seem to have a very rapid downhill course. A great deal is yet unknown about cancer. Some progress has been made in the field of cancer control. When I was a medical student 15 years ago, if we saw a child who had acute leukemia, we knew that child would be dead in 6 months. Now most of those children are living 2 years or 2.5 years because of increased means and better kinds of chemical control. Largely new drugs have come into the field. If we look at the overall field of cancer, we can say that if one considers cancer statistics 40 years ago, there was only 20% of the population that were going to be alive 5 years after a diagnosis of cancer was made. While today about a third of the people will be alive after a diagnosis of cancer is made. So survival rates have increased, and this again largely go due to earlier detection, better therapy, rather than really to understanding the basic cause of the disease. About a third of a million people will die this year from cancer. Another 10 or 20,000 more than that will die next year from cancer. It is still a major disease about which we know yet too little. In the face of all this, though, a crash program in cancer is being proposed at the federal level, as you know. And this one is one of great interest to me, for there are many analogies that are being drawn. We hear, for example, that it was possible during World War II, under great secrecy and great stress and great duress, to produce through the Manhattan Project an atomic bomb. And indeed we did, by massing tremendous manpower and resources and really doing the work on it. We know that when Russia orbited the Sputnik, it was likewise possible through a crash effort for the United States to beat Russia to ruin. We did that. It cost us many billions. Interestingly, though, both of these dealt with realms of physical science, realms where many of the fundamental principles and laws were better understood and better known than they are in biological science. I am not entirely sanguine that it will be possible to apply a similar approach to cancer. I am not entirely certain that investment of untold resources and time and energy will give an absolute result. I'm also trying. I'm not entirely certain that the same analogy, though, can be drawn between the conquest of biological disease process and the conquest of a physical problem. Perhaps it can. I certainly think that it is clear we ought to try, for certainly we will have significant progress and dimensions will be explored that need to be opened. But I think we must be wary of the fact that we may not be entirely successful. And I think this concerns me a great deal because I believe that we in the American people have sometimes been oversold with some very negative effects, with promises being made, give us so much money and we will produce less than so. We may not be able to fulfill such a promise, and I think we must not make it. I think, on the other hand, we must try and really ought to launch full steam ahead in cancer conquest, because I do think the prospect for progress is there. Well, there's a second field that I want to mention just very briefly, which I feel even stronger about the immediate prospects for, and that is the field of organ and tissue transplantation. You know, of course, that kidneys are being transplanted and hearts are being transplanted, and a few lungs and livers and pancreases and thymuses and you name it, bone marrow, are being transplanted, and with greater and greater success every day. Here is an area where a lot has been done in the last 5 years, and tremendous knowledge has been gained about the body's immune processes because of this. I think the next 10 years will see us conquer the immune phenomenon. And I feel pretty confident about that, even though I may live to regret I said that. I think, though, within the next 10 years we will see free and specific transplantation of organs from one person to another. And the exciting thing about all this is that it may, if we're able to do this, it may be possible to induce a state of specific tolerance, such that we can say to an intended recipient, yes, you will be specifically tolerant of this tissue, and your immune system will not be damaged with respect to any other tissue. This, of course, as you know, is one of the big limitations today, that the only way we have of controlling immunity is to dampen it altogether, to the point that you are not only unable to reject the foreign tissue, but you're unable to reject any sort of infectious process that goes with it. And so you're a sitting duck for everything that comes along. Well, if we could get specific tolerance, such that our immune systems would only be non-responsive to the particular tissue, we would have come a long way. So then the concept of spare parts people would become very viable indeed. And I do think that spare parts people will be with us in 10 years. And of course, tied in together with that will be the questions of life and death. What is death? An interesting subject and difficult problem. We could talk a long, long time about that, you know, because here again our concepts have changed very radically. You used to be dead when your heart quit beating, and you know, of course, that's not true at all anymore. You know, dead is soon enough, get there fast enough. One can reinstitute a heartbeat, and many people have been saved through code blue carts and emergency cardiac resuscitation. So that doesn't go anymore. Well, then how about the brain? We used to be dead with brain function stopped, and we still are, if it stops altogether. But a large part of it can stop, and we can be maintained artificially on respirators and with drugs for long periods of time. Are we dead or are we alive? Well, a difficult problem, and one which medicine has wrestled with a great deal and will continue to wrestle with. One state that I know, the state where I am at the moment, Kansas, has settled by statute. And after a great fight, the legislature 2 years ago said, you are dead when a physician says you are dead. Just no way, man, but that's the way it was. And so this, too, will be another problem for us to look to in the future. Well, finally, let me approach the third issue, which is the matter of changes in social structure and value systems and our decision-making processes, which will be subsequent to and consequent to the changes we have discussed before. We must recognize that change has always been to begin with. We must recognize that a fundamental part of the definition of life is adaptability.
Some of you who took basic biology classes maybe many years ago will recognize that if you talked about protoplasm at all, you defined it at least in part as being unique because it could adapt. To live is to adapt. If you do not adapt, you are not alive. And therefore we must change if we're going to continue to live. And that really isn't entirely as circular an argument as it sounds. But it is true that a fundamental part of life is adaptability, and change has always been with us. Now it is also true that the rate of change is increasing, and this means that our rate of adaptation must increase. We must be able to recognize that we have to learn to adapt more rapidly. Many of the changes, however, that we will experience in the future are not without historical precedent in the past. And maybe the problems we face in adapting more rapidly can at least partly be solved by looking a bit to the past. History has many lessons to offer us if we will simply keep them in mind. And again, if I may refer to Mr. Faulkner's book on future thought. On page 249, and I'm offering this only as an example, Mr. Faulkner mentions that, and I quote, corporate families, communes, geriatric group marriages, homosexual family units, and polygamy are a few of the family forms with which innovative minorities will experiment in the decades ahead. Now, once again, I must take some exception. I do not take exception to the fact that some minorities may indeed experiment with these things in decades ahead. But I do take strong exception to the implication that no one has ever tried these before. I thought corporate families were a way of life for early man. I thought that homosexuality was the reason that Genesis gives for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. I thought that polygamy was the reason that the Mormons were attacked by the United States Army and that the Supreme Court struck it down about 70 or 80 years ago. I thought that Santayana made some sense when he said those who don't read history are condemned to relive it. Now, my point is not to say which is good and which is bad. My point is only to say let us learn from the past, and whether we have to change the past and do something different in the future, fine if that's necessary. But let's not close our eyes to what is already available for us to study. For if we do not do this, if we do not study it, we will make our rate of adaptation much more difficult to accommodate. If we do study, I submit that much will be learned by, and much help will be obtained from such a study. Well, now, finally, the changes then that we have noted, both in terms of the organization and delivery of our health care, in terms of the conquest of disease, we have seen that there are some common threads in these. These things have in them an element of commonality in that they involve a greater intrusion of government in our lives. This probably is for the good, but it may not be so if in fact we do not see our obligation to remain responsive and responsible to one another. Now more than ever before in history, we must open up to each other. We must be understanding, accepting. We must work together. We must communicate freely. We must accept responsibility for the other person. We must cast aside chauvinism and selfishness. Now we must do this, for if we do not, and if we do not reach a social consensus and then police our policies, we have the power clearly to destroy ourselves. To do less than to accept our responsibility in this matter will be to live in a life of abysmal destruction and despair, or simply to cease to exist already. Medicine in the next 25 years can hold a great deal for us. It can also hold a great deal that is bad. I think it is up to us to accept responsibility for addressing this course by our social consensus and working together. Thank you for that.